Hi guys. Okay, here we are, chapter 11. So we are officially starting in on kingdoms and classification, which means we'll get to like actual animals and things that you guys recognize. Um, I really love this part of biology. It's what leads into dissection and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully you guys will enjoy this. And like I said, a lot of this should be a little bit more familiar to you than, all the cell stuff that we've already done. Okay, so taxonomy, first off, why and how? And so taxonomy is classifying organisms. It is what scientists use to put organisms into groups with organisms that are similar to themselves, and it's just basically an organizational tool. Um, it does change pretty frequently to adjust for new organisms, or we find out new things about those organisms, and a lot of that is because we've changed how we actually group them. Used to be we classified organisms based on visual characteristics. Do they look the same? Have some of the same physical features. Today, more and more, it is based on genetic characteristics. And so as technology, again, is playing a huge role in that as we kind of catch up and look at different things. Classification is changing. This probably won't change, but today there are 8 levels of classification or taxons that we use to group different organisms. You know these, I know you studied them when you guys were in 7th grade, and so we'll get to that in a minute, but this is a very natural thing for people to do. The Bible tells us that, one of the first things that he had Adam do was name everything, which is essentially kind of, figuring out what it is. And so that's kind of where the system started, again, if you're looking at it from a biblical perspective. Okay, so here are the levels of classification. The top one up there is kind of the weird one. Domains, which we'll talk about more in just a second, are fairly new as far as classification levels go, and they are or the domains are typically just a genetic difference between different organisms. So it's kind of the top of the level, and then we move down to kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And as you move down each level, from class to order, family to genus, whatever it is, you become a little bit more specific in the relationships, the similarities between the two organisms that you're trying to group. So now, obviously, I have a dog and a cat there. This is Sweet Max and Sweet Lulu, my own 2 babies. And notice that they are the same all the way down through order. So they are same groups or same level, put in the same place until here. And then you see the split. And so family is where they are taken away from each other. And again, that has to do with man's interpretation or man's ways of classifying different things. Just so you know, we would be the same as cats and dogs scientifically through class. I believe we are considered mammals. And then when we get to order, that's where we are something different. We would be primates at that point, scientifically. But anyway, so these are the different levels. I'm not going to have you, it's not like I'm going to have you go through and memorize all this information for a bunch of different organisms, but I do want you to know what the levels are. It's going to be a list question on the test. Okay, so now a little bit of the people history of these different levels. So first guy, of course, up there at the top, Aristotle, Greek philosopher, he said things are either plants or animals. Sweet and simple. Sadly, we've made it more complicated than that. And then a long time after that, a guy named Ernst Haeckel said we need a third kingdom for single-celled, what he called protists. And so protists, microscopic, you have to have a microscope to see them. And he said there are these tiny little things swimming around in our water and whatnot, we need to have a kingdom for them. And so then we had a plant kingdom, an animal kingdom, and a protist kingdom. Then again, another pretty big time gap, and a man named Herbert E. Copeland took bacteria out of the protist kingdom and gave it its own kingdom. Bacteria were so prevalent and were so much in the field of study because of illnesses that they caused, and things that they internally do for us, or food sources, that they got their own kingdom. So now we have 4 kingdoms: plant, animals, protists, and bacteria. And then another 40-ish years, and Robert Whitaker removed fungus, mushrooms, molds, those kinds of things, removed the fungi from the plant kingdom and created a 5th kingdom. So now we have plants, animals, protists, bacteria, and fungi. And then the last guy, Carl Woese, 1970s, so not too long after Whitaker, he said that some bacteria need to be removed because of genetic differences. So this is where the big genetic differences started playing a part in it. And he said that we have some bacteria that are kind of your average bacteria, like just meet them every day on the street. And then you have what he called archaea, and these are bacteria that live in very extreme conditions, very cold or very acidic, very hot conditions. And so he said they're genetically different, and we need to separate them out. Carl Woese was also the person who suggested, and we took that suggestion, of putting a level above kingdoms. That's where he's the one who gave us domains. And this was to separate big genetic difference mainly between eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. And so these are kind of the people responsible for our levels of classification. Okay, so now let's get a little bit more specific and talk about species. So scientific classification, and it is a group of organisms that look very similar and have the same structures, same physical characteristics. Typically, it is also defined as a group of organisms that can produce fertile offspring. You heard on the video that we watched with the last unit that there are, like 14, 17, something like that, different definitions of species. So it's hard to kind of keep track of what is technically a species, but those are kind of the general rules. There's problems with it because it's based on physical characteristics, and that not always the true measure of things being related or things being similar. It's just because they look alike. Problem is that people are the ones doing it, and people mess up. Also, it's for convenience, so sometimes we try and kind of fit things together that wouldn't really. And then the last one, there are many species that can interbreed with other species and produce fertile offspring, and that causes a real problem with, are they different species or not? So for example, wolves and dogs are a different species, but they can clearly produce fertile offspring. And then the opposite of that, and I always get the words wrong, donkeys and horses can breed and produce mules, but mules are not fertile. I think that's right. I didn't look that up before. Now I can't remember for sure. And so so that's another one where okay, they are the same, and so anyway, it's kind of a problem, but it is what we use. And so that's the scientific classification level that we typically look at when we're talking about organisms. Okay, so naming organisms. We start with a man named Carolus Linnaeus back in the 17th century, and he produced a system that we now call binomial nomenclature. Binomial means 2 names, and nomenclature means naming. And so these organisms have a genus name and a species name, and the names are written in Latin because it is an unchanging language, so it's not going to, we're not going to redefine anything. It's very descriptive. Like if we knew Latin, we would understand a lot more about what the organisms are. And then at the time, it was well known by many scholars. It's not as well known anymore, but most people do have some background in it if they're in the science field. And so scientific names, it is the genus species name of an organism. When it is written or typed, it's always in italics. We will always underline them. The genus names come first and are always capitalized. The species name comes second and is always lowercase. Okay, so now the second half of chapter 11 has to do with how do scientists today use classification to support evolution, because they do. So because of the things that evolutionists think they are finding out about organisms and the changing relationships, they are trying to organize everything by how their evolutionary relationships, like who evolved from who. And this is a system called systematics. And so it's based on the evolutionary relationships. The idea that birds came from reptiles comes from systematics. And it is based on phylogeny, which is constructing the evolutionary history of organisms, and cladistics, which we'll talk about. And this is basically taking organisms and reclassifying them. In the past, we used anatomy and embryology, so structures and similarities there to determine relationships, but today it is based on genetics and biochemistry. So technology is helping in this case. Doesn't necessarily mean they're doing it right. Okay, so when an organism is grouped, it is grouped by comparing it to similar creatures. What does it look like? Internally, genetically, again, like we were saying. Also, the creature's habitat. Where does it live? And it can be very specific, like, are we talking about the desert or, forest or whatever it is? Oh, and then physical structures again. And then by their evolutionary history. Charles Darwin, in his notes, had different, like, little graphs drawn, like the one right there. That's a phylogenetic tree. And those are supposed to show evolutionary relationships between organisms, current organisms that are living now, and extinct organisms, again, based on assumptions from fossil records and those kinds of things. Okay, so there are thousands of these phylogenetic trees that are each different. That's because everybody has their own opinion. And so there's some problems there. But in general, the scientists will study what they call clades, and this is a very, like a little branch of the tree, and it includes all the descendants of some evolutionary ancestor, so some common ancestor. And they show divergence, and this is a point where two species become more different. So this down here, this little point is divergence, where you go from organisms that have a cartilage skeleton to a bony skeleton. So sorry, I'm not underlining those well, but that's the split. And there you have these derived traits, and this is the trait that leads to the divergence. So in this case, a cartilage or a bone skeleton. And then sometimes they will see convergence, and this is where two dissimilar organisms become more similar. So they evolve the same trait. And so in this case, our shark and our dolphin converge a little bit and have like kind of the streamlined shape again that helps them swim better. So again, it's a very simple one, but hopefully you can kind of see some of the issues there, very opinion based. Okay, so now biblical worldview is based on baraminology, and this is classification based on the created kinds. A kind is a group of organisms that can reproduce, and I have a picture there of the cat kind. And this, of course, is just a representation. Noah didn't have a cell phone out taking pictures of all the animals, but from what we understand of the Bible, there were, a certain number of animals on the ark, and we don't really know what they were, but the thought is that there was a cat, and that cat, or those two cats, because remember there was a male and a female, when they left the ark, they went out and reproduced. Their offspring spread out and adapted to the environment that they were in. And that's where we start to see some differences. Baraminology is based on genetics. A domestic cat, your house cat and a lion are 99.9% the same genetically. There are physical features that they use to place species within a kind. And so, some of them are just physical, the ability to purr or whiskers or whatever it is. Some of it is could actually be like the way they act. I have never met a house cat that doesn't think it's like a lion. The way that they hunt and stalk and think that they're can take anybody on. And so you see some of these similarities, and so it's based on the idea of kinds, that there were the original animals that were on the ark, and that those animals have adapted, and that's why we see some differences between my house cat Lulu and the lion in the jungle. Okay, now last thing, so I kind of said all this already, but so animals in the same kind are all adaptations of the original animals from the ark, and this is typically represented by an orchard of life diagram. So that's a very simple one right there. And so you have all of these different organisms, and everything kind of branches from them. Notice like the little dinosaur, he's kind of done. So they don't typically, doesn't mean they keep going, but you do have these different organisms that are adaptations of the original. And there is divergence. You do see the little splits in the branches. And what a scientist might call, a secular scientist might call speciation, the appearance of new species, could happen very quickly, but it is not a different kind. It is still, it is, I don't even know how to say it. It is still genetically very similar, and could still be recognized as as whatever the original is. In the orchard of life, you don't see convergence happening necessarily, but again, looking at things from a designer or a creator viewpoint, a creator would have made animals with similar physical traits to help them survive. There's just there's just no way around that fact, that if something works, it would be used again. Okay, so that's it for chapter 11. Pretty short and sweet and to the point. And as always, we'll go over everything in class. Excuse me. Ask me questions. Bye, guys.